Progress feels like it should create stability, but internally, it often does the opposite. Most people imagine improvement as a clean, upward shift. You change a behavior. You gain momentum. Your life becomes more stable. Psychologically, the system does not move that smoothly, because every person operates inside a familiar equilibrium, an internal balance between stress, identity, habit, and expectation. Even unhealthy patterns create stability, predictable stress, predictable disappointment, predictable emotional cycles. The system learns how to live inside those patterns. You learn how much effort to give, how much success to tolerate, how much attention to expect. None of this is conscious, but it becomes familiar. When genuine progress appears, the equilibrium shifts. New expectations begin forming. New standards appear. New levels of visibility emerge. And the nervous system registers something subtle: unfamiliar territory. Progress does not only create opportunity, it creates uncertainty. If you improve your discipline, your identity begins to change. If you improve your performance, your environment begins to respond differently. Those shifts alter the structure you were used to living inside, and unfamiliar structure creates tension. Not dramatic tension, subtle psychological friction. You begin noticing pressure where there was once comfort, responsibility where there was once excuse, expectation where there was once tolerance. The system has to reorganize itself around the new level. But the mind prefers continuity. It prefers environments it already understands, even if those environments were limiting. Familiar struggle is easier to navigate than unfamiliar stability, because struggle has rules you already know. You know how to fail in familiar ways. You know how to recover. You know how to explain it. Progress removes those scripts. When improvement appears, the system must update its internal map. New identity, new expectations, new pressure. Updating that map requires adjustment. And adjustment feels unstable before it feels empowering. This is where the early tension of progress appears, not as celebration, as discomfort. You feel slightly restless, slightly uncertain, slightly pulled backward, not because you want to regress, but because the system recognizes unfamiliar ground. Progress disrupts the equilibrium you learned to operate inside, and disruption always feels unstable before it becomes normal. Which is why the moment after improvement is often the moment the mind quietly begins pulling you back. Progress often happens faster than identity updates. Behavior can change in weeks. Identity can take far longer. You can become more disciplined, more consistent, more capable. But internally, the self-image may still belong to an earlier version of you. This creates psychological lag. The external pattern improves. The internal narrative remains outdated. You still think like the person you used to be. Someone who once struggled with consistency may begin performing reliably. But internally, they still see themselves as unreliable. Someone who begins succeeding may still feel like an imposter. The mind prefers coherence between identity and behavior. When the two become misaligned, tension forms. If your actions say, "I am capable," but your identity says, "I am inconsistent," the system detects contradiction. Contradiction destabilizes the internal narrative, and the mind moves quickly to resolve instability. There are two ways to resolve it: update identity or adjust behavior. Updating identity requires time, and psychological restructuring. Adjusting behavior is faster, which is why regression can appear after improvement. Not because the progress was fake, not because the effort was meaningless, but because the internal story had not caught up yet. If you still believe you are the type of person who procrastinates, you will eventually recreate procrastination. If you still believe success is temporary, you will behave as if stability cannot last. Identity quietly pulls behavior back toward its familiar shape. This is not conscious sabotage, it is narrative correction. The mind is attempting to restore alignment between the story you believe and the behavior you are displaying. If the story remains unchanged, behavior begins drifting back toward it. This is why progress can feel unstable in the early stages. You are living in a version of yourself your identity has not fully accepted. Your actions say one thing, your self-concept says another. That gap creates friction, and friction demands resolution. Until identity begins to absorb the new pattern, the system continues pulling toward the familiar version. Not because improvement is unwanted, but because coherence is psychologically necessary. The mind would rather return to a consistent identity than sustain a version of itself it does not yet recognize, which is why early progress often feels fragile. You are not only changing behavior, you are renegotiating who you believe you are. If this perspective resonates, like the video. Subscribe if you want more. No pressure, just awareness. There is another force beneath regression. Familiarity. Human systems adapt to what they repeat. Not just habits, emotional environments. Some people become familiar with calm. Others become familiar with tension. Familiar does not mean pleasant. It means predictable. If your life has contained cycles of pressure, urgency, and recovery, your nervous system learns that rhythm. Stress becomes structured. Deadlines create activation. Failure creates explanation. Recovery restores temporary relief. The cycle becomes recognizable. Progress interrupts that rhythm. When discipline stabilizes, when performance becomes consistent, when things begin working smoothly, the familiar cycle disappears. And with it, a strange sensation appears. Quiet. Not peaceful quiet, unfamiliar quiet. Without constant urgency, the nervous system has less stimulation. Without frequent failure, the emotional storyline becomes thinner. Life begins to feel stable. But stability can feel strangely empty when you are not used to it. For someone accustomed to volatility, calm can register as absence. Absence of tension. Absence of adrenaline. Absence of urgency. The system interprets absence as loss, not consciously, but physiologically. Your nervous system searches for the familiar level of activation. If stability feels unfamiliar, the mind begins recreating conditions it understands. Procrastination, overcommitment, unnecessary risk. Not because you want to fail, because failure restores the rhythm you recognize. Pressure returns. Urgency returns. The emotional storyline becomes active again, and the system relaxes into something it knows how to navigate. Familiar struggle feels safer than unfamiliar stability. When life improves, many people expect relief. What they encounter instead is unfamiliar calm. And unfamiliar calm can feel psychologically disorienting. You no longer have the old narrative. You are not reacting constantly. You are not repairing frequent mistakes. The identity built around struggle begins to lose structure. Without struggle, who are you? That question often appears quietly after progress. Not as curiosity, as unease. The mind then searches for ways to restore familiarity. It does not announce this intention. It simply nudges behavior toward known territory. You delay something that matters. You neglect a pattern that was stabilizing. You create pressure where none existed. The old rhythm reappears, and the nervous system relaxes into the familiar architecture. Not because progress was unwanted, but because unfamiliar stability felt harder to interpret than familiar struggle. Regression after improvement often reflects a simple truth. The system knows how to live inside tension. It has not yet learned how to live inside calm. Self-sabotage after progress often looks irrational. From the outside, it appears careless or even deliberate. You improve something important. Your habits stabilize. Your environment begins responding differently. Then something shifts. A missed step. A neglected pattern. A quiet drift back toward what used to exist. And the question appears, why would someone damage their own progress? Because the system is not trying to destroy progress. It is trying to restore coherence. Every psychological system organizes itself around a familiar identity, a known level of pressure, a recognizable emotional rhythm. Progress disrupts that structure. Not only externally, internally. Your environment begins to treat you differently. Expectations rise. Responsibility expands. But internally, the old identity may still be present. The one that expected inconsistency. The one that expected struggle. The one that understood life through friction. When those identities collide, the system attempts correction. Not correction toward improvement, correction toward familiarity. If the old narrative says, I lose momentum, I fall back eventually, I can't maintain stability, behavior begins quietly confirming that story. Not through dramatic collapse, through small shifts, missed structures, relaxed discipline, enough movement to restore the familiar pattern. From the outside, this looks like sabotage. But internally, it feels like resolution. The narrative and the behavior match again. Coherence returns. This is why improvement can trigger regression, not because progress is dangerous, but because progress temporarily disrupts identity. And identity resists abrupt replacement. Over time, if progress continues, the internal narrative begins adjusting. What once felt unfamiliar becomes ordinary. What once felt unstable becomes routine. The identity slowly reorganizes around the new pattern. When that happens, the need for correction disappears. Progress stops feeling fragile. Stability stops feeling suspicious, and the system no longer needs to return to the previous rhythm. Self-sabotage after progress is rarely about weakness. It is about a system protecting its sense of continuity, even when that continuity once limited you. If this perspective resonated, consider liking the video and subscribing, not to eliminate regression, but to understand why progress sometimes triggers it.